Dad, the realtor, said the first thing we need to do is clear out Mom's old things. He called them personal clutter. The words came through the phone, sharp and clean, slicing through the heavy silence of my kitchen. It was Brianna, my daughter-in-law. I didn't say anything back. I just pressed the red icon on the screen and let the silence rush back in, colder this time. Personal clutter. That's what she called the evidence of a 45-year marriage. That's what she called my Evelyn. I stood there for a long time, the phone growing heavy in my hand. It had been 2 weeks since the funeral. 2 weeks of waking up to a house that had forgotten how to breathe. The air was thick with her absence, a physical presence that filled every room. My gaze fell on her chair, the worn floral armchair tucked into the corner of the kitchen by the window. Her book was still on the side table, a slim volume of poetry with a pair of reading glasses resting on top, forever marking the page she would never finish. Every morning for the last 30 years, she had sat in that chair, a cup of black tea in her hands, and watched the sun come up over the pine trees that lined our property. That chair was the heart of our home. To Brianna, it was just clutter. My feet carried me to the window. Outside, the wild rose bushes Evelyn had planted along the old stone wall were starting to look thirsty. She had loved those roses. She said they were stubborn and beautiful, like all the best things in life. Beyond the garden was my workshop. The scent of sawdust and linseed oil used to drift from it, a smell Evelyn claimed was my own personal cologne. Now its windows were dark. The tools inside were still. It felt like another empty room, another part of my life that had gone quiet. The emptiness was a constant ache in my chest, a hollow space where laughter and conversation used to be. I thought I was just a man drowning in grief. But after Brianna's call, I realized I was something else. I was an obstacle. The memory came back then, unbidden and sharp, as clear as the day it happened. The sterile white room, the rhythmic beep of the machine next to her bed. The feel of her hand in mine, so frail, but with a strength that defied the illness that was taking her. Her eyes, clouded with pain, had suddenly cleared. She looked right at me, a focus in her gaze that startled me. "James," she had whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Listen to me. If they make it hard for you, you call David. Don't argue with them. Don't fight. Just do exactly what I've set up." She squeezed my hand, a faint pressure that was both a plea and a command. "I've played my last move for us, my love. For both of us." At the time, I thought it was just the talk of a mind drifting away on a sea of medication. I had nodded and squeezed her hand back, whispering that everything would be all right, that she didn't need to worry. I thought she was just trying to comfort me, to give me one last thing to hold on to. A final move. It sounded like something from the chess games we used to play on rainy Sunday afternoons. But now, standing in the cold silence of my kitchen with Brianna's cruel words still echoing in the air, Evelyn's final whisper no longer sounded like delirium. It sounded like a battle plan. I looked back at her empty chair, at the quiet dignity of the space she had left behind. The grief was still there, a vast and endless ocean. But now, something else was rising through it. Not anger, not yet. It was the faintest glimmer of resolve. My wife had been a planner. She had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else. And apparently, she had planned for this, too. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, pulling into the long gravel driveway in a sleek black SUV that looked out of place against the backdrop of old pine trees and weathered fieldstone. I watched from the living room window as Brianna got out first, her movements sharp and efficient. She smoothed down her expensive-looking coat and looked at the house, not like a daughter visiting her grieving father, but like a developer assessing a property. Malik emerged a moment later, slower, more hesitant. He paused to look at the workshop for a second, a flicker of something unreadable on his face before following his wife to the front door. I opened it before they could knock. Malik managed a weak smile and mumbled, "Hey, Dad." He went to hug me, but it was an awkward, clumsy embrace that ended too quickly. Brianna, on the other hand, gave me a perfectly practiced hug, her perfume filling the air with a scent that was too sweet, too chemical for the quiet honesty of this house. "James, we've been so worried about you," she said, her voice a carefully modulated performance of concern. They sat on the sofa opposite the armchair where I had spent most of the last 2 weeks, a silent island in my own living room. Malik fidgeted with his phone, trying to ask how I was sleeping, how I was eating, but his questions were hollow, lacking the warmth of genuine care. He kept glancing at Brianna, waiting for his cue. It didn't take long for her to provide it. She leaned forward, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his knee, a gesture that was both a signal for him to be quiet and a way for her to take the stage. "James," she began, her voice softening into that syrupy tone she used when she wanted something. "Malik and I have been thinking a lot. We love you so much, and that's why this is so hard to say." She paused for dramatic effect. "This house, this beautiful land, it's just too much for one person. The property taxes here in North Carolina aren't cheap, and the upkeep alone is a full-time job. We think it's time to consider a smarter option. We could sell it and find you a wonderful modern luxury apartment, something upscale and safer with staff on hand if you ever need anything." I looked at my son. Malik just nodded, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor somewhere to my left. "She's right, Dad," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. "Brianna is just worried about your health. We both are." He refused to meet my gaze. He couldn't, because he knew they weren't talking about my health. They were talking about their inheritance, an inheritance they had apparently decided was already theirs to manage. I remained silent, letting the weight of their proposal hang in the air. My silence was a void, and Brianna, never comfortable without being in control, rushed to fill it. She stood up and began to walk around the room, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floors that I had installed with Evelyn 30 years ago. "And honestly, the market is perfect right now," she continued, her voice gaining a business-like enthusiasm. "We could get a fantastic price. It would set you up for life with plenty left over." She ran a finger over the dark wood of the built-in bookshelves I had spent a whole winter crafting. Of course, a new owner would want to modernize. We'd have to get rid of all these old dark fixtures, open up the space, maybe tear out these bookshelves to improve the flow. Every word was a small, calculated erasure of my wife, of our life. These weren't just fixtures. They were the lights Evelyn had picked out. These weren't just bookshelves. They were filled with the books we had read to each other, with the novels that had shaped our world. Brianna didn't see a home filled with love and history. She saw an asset with outdated features. She saw square footage and profit margins. And she saw me not as her husband's father, but as the single inconvenient obstacle standing between her and a significant payday. I looked from her confident posture to my son's slumped shoulders. I was beginning to understand. This wasn't a conversation. It was the opening move in a campaign. And deep inside me, beneath the crushing weight of grief, I could hear Evelyn's whisper clear as a bell. "I've played my last move for us." The quiet of the house became my shield. After their first visit, I retreated into my memories and the familiar comfort of routine, but Brianna would not allow me that peace. Her campaign began subtly, a series of calculated intrusions designed to wear me down. The first shots in her psychological war arrived through the mail slot. They were large, glossy brochures printed on heavy cardstock. On the covers, silver-haired men and women with impossibly white teeth laughed as they played golf or sat by a pristine swimming pool. The names were always something serene and vaguely condescending. Golden Vista Senior Living, Tranquil Horizons Retirement Community, Your Next Chapter Perfected. I knew immediately they were from her. It was her style, impersonal, expensive, and utterly devoid of heart. Each brochure was a message, a reminder that my time in this house was, in her mind, running out. I would stand in the entryway, the scent of fresh ink and false promises rising from the pages, and feel a cold knot tighten in my stomach. She was trying to sell me a future I did not want, a pre-packaged version of old age that looked more like a well-managed holding facility than a life. I would look at the smiling faces and see only the hollowness in their eyes. I threw each one in the trash, but more always came a relentless tide of glossy paper meant to erode the shores of my resolve. The escalation came on a Tuesday. The air was crisp and the scent of pine was sharp in the cool afternoon. I was in my workshop, the one place I still felt truly at peace. The rhythmic pull and push of a hand plane over a piece of cherry wood was a kind of meditation. The scent of the shavings, the feel of the grains smoothing under my touch, it was the only conversation that made sense to me anymore. I was so lost in the work that I almost didn't see them. But a flash of movement in the garden caught my eye. I looked up and my hands stilled on the plane. There, standing in the middle of Evelyn's rose garden, was Brianna. Beside her was a man in a sharp-tailored suit holding a tablet. He pointed toward the house, then toward the old oak tree at the edge of the property, making notes as Brianna spoke, and nodded with a look of triumphant satisfaction. They were not admiring the garden. They were measuring it. They were assessing its value, their voices too low for me to hear, but their intentions as clear as the glass in my window. A cold, quiet rage began to build inside me. This was a violation. This was a sacred space, and they were treating it like a vacant lot. I set my plane down with deliberate care, wiped the sawdust from my hands onto my jeans, and walked out of the workshop. I did not hurry. My steps were even and measured across the lawn. As I approached, they stopped talking. Brianna's smile was bright and brittle. "James, I didn't see you there. This is Mr. Henderson, a friend of ours. He's in real estate and was just giving me some advice on improving the curb appeal." The lie was so transparent it was insulting. Mr. Henderson looked deeply uncomfortable, his professional smile faltering under my steady gaze. I didn't look at Brianna. I looked directly at him. "This is private property," I said. My voice was low, but it carried the weight of ownership. "Your tour is over." He had the decency to look ashamed. He mumbled a quick apology about a misunderstanding and made a hasty retreat, leaving Brianna standing alone amidst Evelyn's roses, her face tight with fury. That evening I called Malik. I needed to hear it from him. "Your wife brought a realtor onto our property today," I said, keeping my voice level. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I heard him take a breath. "Oh, Dad, I really don't know anything about that. I was stuck in meetings all day, back to back." The excuse was weak, pathetic. I could picture him on the other end, rubbing his forehead, unable to look at himself in a mirror. "She's trying to sell this house from under me, son," I said, giving him one last chance to stand with me. His reply was the final quiet betrayal. I'm sure she just wants to help. You know how proactive Brianna is. She probably just thought she was getting an opinion, that's all. I'll talk to her." But we both knew he wouldn't. He would go home and let Brianna tell him what to think, what to feel. He had made his choice. He was not my son in this fight. He was her accomplice. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of the living room, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I was completely alone. The feeling was not one of self-pity, but of a grim, hardening clarity. Evelyn's words echoed in my mind. "Don't argue. Just do what I've set up." Now I understood why. You cannot argue with people who refuse to see you. You cannot reason with a son who has willingly given away his own voice. My victory after sending the realtor away was short-lived. I had drawn a line in the sand, and in doing so, I had challenged Brianna directly. I knew she would not let it go, but I was not prepared for the cruelty of her next attack. She had tried to wear me down with brochures and then with a direct assault on my property. When those failed, she decided to aim for the heart of my independence, for my very right to exist as a free man. The phone rang 3 days later. I saw her name on the screen and my hand hesitated over the phone. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to refuse her entry into my home even through a simple phone call, but I knew that was not an option. Ignoring her would only fuel her narrative that I was avoidant, confused, and unable to face reality. I took a breath and answered. "James," she began, her voice a poisonous blend of feigned sympathy and condescension. "I'm calling because I am just so terribly worried after what happened the other day. When Mr. Henderson was here, you seemed so agitated, so unlike yourself. Malik and I have been talking, and we are both just so concerned that your grief is affecting your judgment." I could hear the trap being set in her careful choice of words. She was twisting my righteous anger, my defense of my own home, into a symptom of mental decline. I started to speak to tell her that I was perfectly fine, but she cut me off, her voice lowering into a conspiratorial whisper. "James, I'm genuinely concerned about your mental state. Maybe Malik and I should talk to a lawyer about a conservatorship to help you manage your assets. We just don't want you making any poor decisions while you're grieving." The word landed in the quiet of my living room with the force of a physical blow. Conservatorship. It was the ultimate weapon, the one thing that could strip away everything. My home, my finances, my decisions, my identity. All of it gone, handed over to her control. The blood ran cold in my veins. This was not an idle threat. This was her next move, a legal maneuver to have me declared incompetent, a prisoner in my own life. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me as I gripped the armrest of my chair. She knew exactly what that word meant to a man my age, the terror it inspired. It was a declaration of war, and she had just aimed her biggest gun directly at me. I ended the call without another word, my hand trembling as I set the phone down. For a moment I could not breathe. My mind was reeling. They would stand up in a courtroom and lie, paint me as a confused old man lost in his sorrow, unable to care for himself. And people would believe them. People always believed the concerned, well-dressed children over the grieving elderly parent. My first desperate instinct was to call my son. He had to know. He would not let this happen. He could not. I fumbled with the phone and dialed his number. He answered on the third ring, his voice wary. "Dad, is everything okay?" My voice was ragged, strained. "Malik, your wife just called me. She threatened to put me under a conservatorship." I laid the ugly word out between us, praying that it would shock him into action. But the response that came back was not a roar of outrage on my behalf. It was a weak, deflating sigh. "Dad, I think Brianna is just overreacting. You know how she gets. She's just worried. She reads these articles online about finances and seniors and she panics." It was the most pathetic excuse I had ever heard. "Panic," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to control it. "This wasn't panic, Malik. This was a threat. She is trying to take away my right to live my own life." There was another long pause. I could hear him breathing, the sound of a man trying to find the words to placate both sides, a man who had long ago forgotten how to stand on his own. "Look," he said finally, his voice rushed. "Let me talk to her, okay? I'll handle it. She's just stressed out. Don't worry about it." He promised to talk to her, but the promise was as empty as his voice. We both knew he would do nothing. We both knew he would go home, and Brianna would tell him that she was right and he would agree, because agreeing was easier than fighting for his own father. I hung up the phone, and the last flicker of hope I had for my son died. He had not just chosen his wife over me. He had chosen her greed over my freedom. He had chosen to be her enabler as she tried to erase me. I was utterly and completely on my own. The threat of conservatorship hung in the air between us for a week, an unspoken poison. I did not hear from them, and I did not call. I tried to find a sense of normalcy, to lose myself in the familiar rhythms of my workshop, but the peace was gone. Every sound from the road made me flinch. Every phone call from an unknown number made my heart pound. I was a stranger in my own home, waiting for the next attack. I knew it was coming. Brianna was not the type to make a threat and then back down. She was simply choosing her moment. That moment came on a Thursday morning, the day of my routine checkup with my doctor, an appointment that had been on the calendar for 3 months. It felt like any other day. I finished my coffee, tidied the kitchen, and left a note for myself to pick up more birdseed on the way home. The drive into town was quiet. The doctor told me my blood pressure was a little high, but otherwise I was in good health for a man of 69. He told me to avoid stress. I almost laughed. Driving home, a fragile sense of calm settled over me. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they had thought better of their cruel plan, but the moment I turned into my driveway, I knew how wrong I was. My life was piled on the front lawn, not just a few things. Everything. Boxes overflowing with my clothes, stacks of my favorite books tied haphazardly with twine, even my old leather armchair, its legs pointing accusingly at the sky. They had packed my existence into cardboard and black trash bags and discarded it like garbage. A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, washed over me. I got out of my truck on unsteady legs and walked toward the front door, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. I reached for my keys, my hand shaking, and slid my house key into the lock. It wouldn't go in all the way. I tried again, pushing harder, but it was useless. The metallic scrape of old brass against new steel was a sound of finality. The lock had been changed. I was locked out of my own home, the home I had built with my own hands, the home where I had raised my son and loved my wife. I stumbled back from the door, a wave of disbelief and rage threatening to overwhelm me. And then I saw him. Through the large living room window, I saw my son. Malik was standing there, his back half turned, looking out at me. His face was a mask of misery and shame. He saw me. He saw the wreckage of my life strewn across the lawn. He saw me standing there, a homeless man on my own property. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that moment I saw all the love and history between us turn to ash. Then he looked away. He could not face me. He could not face what he had allowed to happen. The front door opened and Brianna stepped out onto the porch. She held her phone in one hand, her face a mask of cold, detached efficiency. She did not look at my discarded belongings. She did not look at the pain on my face. She looked somewhere over my shoulder as if I were a minor inconvenience she was handling. "I've called an Uber for you, James," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "It will be here in 5 minutes. I've also prepaid for the first week at the Oakwood Service Apartments downtown. It will be better for everyone this way." I wanted to scream. I wanted to rage at her, to demand to know how she could be so heartless. But the words wouldn't come. My throat was tight with a grief that was deeper than the loss of my wife. I looked past her, back to the window, back to my son. He was still there, a statue of shame, a ghost in his own life, watching as his wife dismantled his father. He would not move, he would not speak, he would not come to the door. And in his gutless, deafening silence, I heard the full and terrible truth. His silence was his consent. His inaction was his betrayal. It was the cruelest complicity of all. A strange calm descended upon me. Then the kind of clarity that comes only after everything has been lost. I understood what Evelyn had meant. Don't fight. Fighting them was pointless. The battle had already been lost, not today but years ago, when my son had decided that his wife's ambition was more important than his father's heart. I turned away from the house without a word. The Uber pulled up, but I waved it on. I walked to my old truck, my movements steady and deliberate. I began to load my life, my clutter, into the back. Each box was heavy with the weight of their betrayal. As I closed the tailgate, I took one last look. Brianna was still on the porch, a small, triumphant smile on her lips. Malik was gone from the window. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I drove with no destination in mind, the familiar streets of my town suddenly feeling alien and hostile. My life packed into the bed of my old truck rattled behind me with every bump in the road. I passed the gleaming glass tower of the Oakwood Service Apartments, the sterile, pre-packaged cage Brianna had chosen for me. A surge of defiant anger, hot and clean, cut through the numb fog of my grief. I would not sleep in a bed they had paid for. I would not live by their rules. I kept driving, heading toward the industrial outskirts of town where the streets were wider and the buildings were more honest about their age. I found what I was looking for on a stretch of highway dotted with warehouses and all-night diners. The Starlight Motel, its neon sign flickering a tired welcome into the deepening twilight. It was the kind of place that offered privacy and asked no questions. It was perfect. The room was small and smelled of stale cigarette smoke and strong disinfectant. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern from a decade I barely remembered. A heavy television was bolted to the dresser. It was the loneliest room I had ever been in. I brought in my boxes and bags, the sad, jumbled artifacts of my life. I carefully unwrapped the framed photograph of Evelyn and me on our wedding day and set it on the nightstand. I placed my father's old hand plane next to it. I stacked my books on the floor. Arranging these few precious things in this cold, impersonal space was an act of survival, a way to prove to myself that I still existed, that I was more than the pile of clutter they had thrown onto the lawn. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, the reality of my situation crashing down on me. I was 69 years old. My wife was gone. My son had betrayed me. I was homeless, living out of a motel room with no one in the world to turn to. A wave of despair so profound it almost buckled me, washed over me. I buried my face in my hands, the rough calluses of my palms scraping against my tear-wet cheeks. And in that moment of absolute darkness, I heard her voice as clear as if she were sitting right next to me. "James, if they make it hard for you, you call David." The memory of her words, of her fierce, determined gaze in that hospital room cut through my sorrow. "Don't argue. Just do what I've set up." It wasn't delirium. It wasn't a comforting fantasy. It was an instruction. I lifted my head, my breath catching in my throat. I was not without a plan. I was simply at the beginning of hers. My hands shook as I dug through my old wallet, past the faded pictures and expired cards, until my fingers found the bent business card I had tucked away years ago. David Chen, attorney at law. I walked out of my room and into the chilly night air, heading for the old payphone near the motel office. I did not want this call traced. I did not know the extent of Brianna's plans, and I would take no chances. The phone felt cold and heavy in my hand as I dropped the coins in and dialed the number. A calm, professional voice answered. "Chen and Associates?" I asked for David, and after a moment he was on the line. "This is David Chen." I took a steadying breath. "David?" I said, my own voice sounding strange to me. "It's James Carter." There was a pause, but it was not a pause of confusion. It was a pause of recognition, of anticipation. When he spoke again, his voice was different. It was calm, steady, and filled with a warmth that felt like a lifeline. "I've been waiting for your call, James." The relief that flooded through me was so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. I leaned against the cold glass of the phone booth, the story of the last few days pouring out of me in a ragged emotional torrent. The changed locks, my things on the lawn, my son's silent betrayal. David listened patiently without interruption. When I was finished, he spoke with the same unshakable calm. "I know it's hard to hear this right now, James, but everything is going according to plan. Evelyn predicted every last detail. By doing what they did, by forcing you from your home, they have triggered everything. The game is already in motion and they don't even know they're playing." His words were a balm on my wounded soul. I was not a victim. I was a key player in my wife's final brilliant strategy. "Get some rest tonight, James," David said. "Don't contact Malik or Brianna. Don't speak to anyone. Come to my office tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp. Evelyn left very clear instructions for us." I hung up the phone and stood for a moment under the flickering neon of the motel sign. The world was still a cold and lonely place, but for the first time in 2 weeks, I was not afraid. I had a purpose. I had a plan. Or rather, I had Evelyn's plan, and I would see it through to the end. I slept in fits and starts, the unfamiliar sounds of the motel filtering through the thin walls. The rumble of late-night trucks on the highway, the murmur of a television in the next room, the sharp slam of a car door. But for the first time in weeks, my thoughts were not consumed by grief. They were filled with a nervous anticipation. When morning finally came, I dressed in my cleanest set of clothes and drove to David Chen's office downtown. His office was on the top floor of an old, respectable brick building. The space was a quiet sanctuary of dark wood, leather-bound books, and the hushed professionalism of a man who dealt in facts, not drama. It was the complete opposite of the chaos my life had become, and I felt a sense of calm settle over me as his secretary led me into his office. David greeted me not with pity, but with a firm handshake and a warm, steady gaze. "James, I'm glad you're here," he said, gesturing for me to sit in one of the comfortable leather chairs facing his large mahogany desk. "Let's get straight to it. I know you have questions." He didn't waste time with small talk. He pulled a thick leather-bound portfolio from his drawer and placed it on the desk between us. It was embossed with gold letters that read, "The Carter Family Trust." "James," he began, his voice calm and deliberate. "Several years ago, Evelyn came to me. She was worried. She had seen the direction Brianna was pulling Malik, and she wanted to ensure that no matter what happened after she was gone, your life and your home would be absolutely secure. She knew a simple will could be challenged. So we created something much stronger, a legal fortress." He opened the portfolio. "This is an irrevocable trust. Think of it as a locked box. Years ago, Evelyn and you as co-trustees placed the most important assets inside this box: the house, the surrounding land, and a significant portion of your investment portfolio. Once inside, those assets are no longer governed by personal wishes or whims. They are governed only by the strict, unchangeable rules of the trust itself." I listened, my mind slowly grasping the scale of what she had done. This was not a last-minute thought. This was a long-term strategy built on years of quiet observation. David turned a page, his finger landing on a densely worded paragraph. "This, James, is the heart of her plan. It's the engine that makes it all work. In legal terms, it's called an in terrorem clause. It is essentially a no-contest clause, but Evelyn and I crafted it to be something more. We called it her dignity clause." He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "In simple terms, the trust names Malik with Brianna as his spouse as the primary beneficiaries. They were set to inherit everything after you passed on. However, that inheritance was entirely conditional." He then read a part of the clause aloud, the legal language sounding like a beautiful, ironclad piece of poetry. He then translated it for me. "It means their entire inheritance was dependent on them honoring your right to live in your home with peace and dignity." The clause is very specific. It states that any action taken to forcibly remove you from the property, to restrict your access to change the locks, or to initiate legal proceedings that challenge your mental competency will be considered a direct contestation of the trust's terms. And any such contestation results in their immediate and permanent disinheritance. It is as if their names were never in the trust to begin with. A slow, dawning understanding spread through me. It was brilliant. It was absolute. "So when they changed the locks," I whispered, when they threw my things on the lawn. David nodded slowly, a somber look on his face. They didn't just do something cruel, James. They made a formal legal move. They held up their end of the contract Evelyn wrote for them. They triggered the clause. As of yesterday, Malik and Brianna Carter have been legally and permanently disinherited from this trust. I sat back in my chair speechless, but David was not finished. The trust is very clear about what happens next. When the primary beneficiaries are removed, the assets flow directly to the alternate beneficiary. He reached into another drawer and pulled out a second, newer folder. He opened it to reveal official incorporation documents. For the last 2 years of her life, Evelyn was secretly working with me to establish a nonprofit foundation. It's called Evelyn's Workshop for Young Builders. Its legal mission is to provide scholarships and paid apprenticeships to young people in our community who want to learn a skilled trade like woodworking, masonry, or mechanics. He pushed the documents toward me. As of the moment they locked you out, this foundation became the sole beneficiary of the Carter Family Trust. It's all theirs, James. The house, the land, the investments. And the foundation's bylaws, written by Evelyn herself, name you as the lifetime chairman of the board with full authority to live in the house and manage the foundation's programs as you see fit. I stared at the papers, at the name of the foundation, at the sheer breathtaking brilliance of my wife's love. This was not about revenge. It was about preservation and creation. She had not only protected me, she had created a legacy that would go on helping others, a legacy of building things, not tearing them down. I thought my heart could not handle any more revelations. I thought I had seen the full scope of my wife's meticulous, loving plan. But David held up his hand, signaling there was one more thing. He reached into the leather portfolio one last time and pulled out 2 items. The first was a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with a simple wax stamp. My name, James, was written on the front in Evelyn's elegant, familiar script. The second was a small silver USB drive. She wanted you to have these last, David said, his voice gentle. She said this was the most important part. This is the why. He slid them across the polished desk. My hand trembled as I reached for the envelope. The paper was cool to the touch, and I could almost feel her presence in its weight and the careful loops of her handwriting. For a moment, I just held it, my thumb tracing the outline of her name. Opening it felt like a final goodbye, a conversation I wasn't ready to end. But I knew I had to. With fumbling fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. Her words filled the page, a final message from the love of my life. My dearest James, it began. If you are reading this, it means the worst has happened, and my heart aches for the pain you must be in. But it also means our plan has worked. I am not writing this letter to explain the trust. David has done that. I am writing to explain our son. My eyes blurred with tears, and I had to pause to wipe them away. The letter continued. I know how much you love him, and I know this betrayal must feel like a knife in your heart. But please, my love, do not let this turn your heart to stone. This plan, this entire fortress we built, was not designed to punish Malik. It was designed to save him. For years, I have watched him fade away. I have watched Brianna's ambition and greed become a poison ivy slowly wrapping around him, choking the good man we raised. He is trapped, James. Trapped by his own weakness, by his fear of her disapproval. He has forgotten who he is. I could not stand by and watch him lose his soul completely. Taking away the money, the house, the inheritance that Brianna so desperately craves is the only way to remove her power over him. It is a harsh medicine, I know, but it is the only chance he has to break free, to find himself again. This is not an act of vengeance. It is a mother's last desperate gamble to save her son. I folded the letter, my heart aching with a love so profound it felt like it would break me in two. This was not about justice. It was about redemption. David seemed to understand. He quietly took the USB drive and plugged it into a sleek laptop on his desk, turning the screen toward me. She recorded a video message, he said softly. A personal codicil to the will. She wanted Malik to see it someday if he was ever ready. He pressed play, and there she was. Evelyn sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, the one now sitting on my lawn. She looked tired, thinner than I remembered, but her eyes were clear and strong. She looked directly into the camera as if she were looking right at our son. Malik, she said, her voice steady and filled with a mother's love. If you are seeing this, it means you have lost everything you thought you were entitled to. and I need you to know that I did this because I love you. Real love, my son, isn't weakness. It is not about giving people what they want. It's about giving them what they need to become the best version of themselves." Her voice cracked just for a moment. "I hope that without the weight of all that money, without the pressure of Brianna's desires, you will finally find the one thing you have been missing. Not an inheritance, but the strength of your own character. That is my final wish for you. That is my true legacy." The video ended, and the screen went black, leaving only my reflection staring back at me. I left David's office with a heavy heart but a steady hand. The weight of Evelyn's love, so fierce and protective, felt like armor around my soul. David told me he would handle the next step. A certified letter would be sent, a simple formal notification that would act as the trigger for the final act of our play. I spent the rest of the day in my quiet motel room, not in sorrow, but in a state of solemn preparation. I could almost picture the scene as it would unfold, a silent movie playing in my mind. The crisp official envelope arriving at the home that was once mine, a piece of irrefutable truth landing on their doorstep. While I was imagining it, it was happening. The mail carrier arrived at their sleek modern mailbox in the late afternoon. Brianna signed for the certified letter with an air of casual annoyance, likely assuming it was some mundane paperwork from a contractor for the renovations she was already planning. I can see her slitting the envelope open with a polished fingernail, her expression shifting from impatience to confusion, and then to a mask of pure, unadulterated rage as she read the cold, precise legal language. The letter was not emotional. It was a blade. It stated without flourish that pursuant to Article 4, Section 3 of the Carter Family Irrevocable Trust, their actions on the 14th of October constituted a direct contestation of the trust's terms. As such, their status as beneficiaries had been terminated effective immediately. All assets of the trust, the letter concluded, had now been transferred in full to the designated alternate beneficiary, Evelyn's Workshop for Young Builders. The explosion, when it came, was not born of sadness. It was the volcanic eruption of a narcissist who had been outsmarted. "That old witch!" she shrieked, the carefully constructed facade of the sophisticated wife shattering into 1,000 pieces. "Even from the grave she is trying to control us." She crumpled the letter in her fist, her face contorted with a fury that was terrifying in its intensity. And then, as Evelyn had predicted, she turned her wrath upon my son. "This is your fault," she screamed, her voice a venomous hiss. She advanced on Malik, who had been reading the letter over her shoulder, his face pale with shock. "This is because of you and your weakness. I told you we had to be aggressive from the start. I told you we should have filed for conservatorship the moment she died. But no, you had to play the part of the sad, dutiful son. You hesitated. You let that broken old man and his ghost of a wife beat us." Her words were a relentless assault, each one a blow against his character, his manhood, his entire being. She saw this not as a tragedy, but as a game she had lost, and she was blaming him for her failure. She immediately snatched her phone from the kitchen island. "This is not over," she snarled, her fingers flying across the screen. "I'm calling Blake Harrison. He is the most ruthless estate lawyer in the state. We will break this trust. We will prove she was senile. We will prove your father manipulated her. We will take back what is ours." But then something happened that she had not anticipated. For the first time in their years of marriage, my son did not cower. He did not apologize. He did not try to placate her. The years of swallowing his own voice, of bending to her, will finally came to an end. A dam inside him broke. "My mother wasn't senile, Brianna," he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through her tirade with the authority of a long-suppressed truth. "She was a genius. She saw you. She saw you for exactly who you are, and she planned for this day." Brianna stared at him, stunned into silence by his sudden defiance. "Don't you dare blame me for this." Malik continued, his voice growing stronger, fueled by years of resentment. "It wasn't my weakness that caused this. It was your greed, your endless, bottomless greed. You were the one who wanted to sell my father's home. You were the one who threw his life onto the lawn. You disrespected my mother's memory every single day you were in that house. You thought this was all a game you could win, but you never even understood who you were playing against." The room was thick with a new, dangerous tension. The power dynamic that had defined their marriage had just been shattered. They were no longer a team. They were two enemies trapped in the ruins of a collapsed empire, and the battle between them had only just begun. The day of the court hearing was gray and overcast, the sky the color of old, worn steel. I sat in the back of the courtroom, a quiet observer in a suit that felt too formal for the ugly business we were there to conduct. I had insisted on being present. I needed to see the final act of Evelyn's play with my own eyes. Brianna and Malik sat at the plaintiff's table with their lawyer, a young slick man named Blake Harrison, who exuded an air of unearned confidence. Brianna was a coiled spring of tension, her back ramrod straight, her expression a mask of defiant righteousness. Malik looked like a ghost beside her, pale and hollowed-out, a man who had already accepted his defeat. Blake Harrison began, his voice smooth and persuasive. He was a performer, and the courtroom was his stage. He painted a masterful, heartbreaking picture for the judge, a portrait of a beloved family matriarch, Evelyn, in the final stages of her life. He spoke of her illness, her vulnerability, the heavy medications that must have clouded her mind. He suggested that in this confused and weakened state, she had been tragically manipulated. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "we are here today because of a classic case of undue influence. We have a grieving, dying woman and a husband, Mr. James Carter, who in her final days inexplicably convinced her to sign away her life's work, disinheriting her only son in the process. He then took control of a foundation set up in her name, a foundation from which he is the primary director. He then turned his attack on Evelyn's state of mind. Furthermore, we contend that Mrs. Carter was not of sound mind when these documents were created. Look at the trust itself. It is not a rational document. It is a punitive, complex trap designed not to preserve a legacy but to sow discord. It is the work of a mind that was tragically beginning to fail. I felt a hot surge of anger in my chest. He was twisting Evelyn's brilliance into a symptom of madness, her love into an act of cruelty. He was desecrating her memory to serve Brianna's greed. But I looked at David Chen, who sat at the defendant's table, calm and impassive, and I held on to my composure. I trusted my wife. I trusted her plan. When it was David's turn, he stood and walked to the podium. He was the complete opposite of Harrison. He was not a performer. He was a craftsman, and evidence was his tool. His voice was quiet, factual, and methodical. "Your Honor," he began, "Mr. Harrison has painted a compelling and emotional picture. The only problem is that it is a work of complete fiction." He first addressed the claim of Evelyn's mental state. The plaintiff contends that Mrs. Carter was not of sound mind when she finalized her estate plan. They offer her illness and the perceived complexity of her trust as their only evidence. I, however, would like to offer some facts. He placed a thick-bound document on the judge's bench. "This, Your Honor, is Exhibit A. It is a full psychiatric competency evaluation for Mrs. Evelyn Carter conducted by Dr. Ann Levine, a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist. This evaluation was conducted on Mrs. Carter's own insistence on the very same day the final trust documents were signed. I will read Dr. Levine's conclusion from her sworn affidavit." David cleared his throat. "It is my professional opinion that Mrs. Carter was of exceptionally sound mind, lucid, and demonstrated a profound and detailed understanding of her financial assets, her family dynamics, and the legal ramifications of the estate plan she had constructed. Her reasoning was clear, consistent, and rational." A murmur went through the courtroom. Brianna's confident smirk faltered. Harrison looked as if he had been slapped, but David was not done. And to remove any possible doubt about Mrs. Carter's wishes and her state of mind, she prepared a video codicil to her will. With the court's permission, I would like to play it now. The clerk dimmed the lights and a screen was lowered. And then there she was, Evelyn. Her strong, loving face filled the screen. Her voice, clear and steady, filled the silent courtroom, a voice from beyond the grave delivering one final, irrefutable testimony. I watched Brianna's face as she watched my wife speak, her expression crumbling from defiance to disbelief, and finally, to the dawning horror of absolute defeat. The judge, a stern woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, did not need long to make her decision after the video ended. She looked down from her bench, her gaze bypassing the lawyers and landing directly on Brianna. "Mrs. Carter," the judge said, her voice cold with disapproval, "the evidence presented here today is overwhelming. Your mother-in-law was not a confused or incompetent woman. She was a brilliant and thoughtful woman who took extraordinary measures to protect her husband from what she clearly anticipated would be emotional and financial abuse." The judge's words were like hammer blows. "This court finds that this petition was filed frivolously and with malicious intent. It is a shameful attempt to use the legal system to harass a grieving man. Therefore, the petition is dismissed with prejudice." She brought her gavel down with a sharp crack. "And furthermore, the plaintiffs will be responsible for all of the defendant's legal fees." It was over. Brianna sat frozen, her face white with humiliation and rage. Malik simply slumped forward in his chair, a completely broken man. I stood up, turned my back on the wreckage of their lives, and walked quietly out of the courtroom. I walked out of the courtroom and did not look back. The victory felt heavy, not like a celebration, but like the quiet, somber end of a long and painful war. The house was waiting for me, the silence in its rooms no longer feeling like grief, but like peace. That evening, David called. He informed me of the final details with his usual professional calm. The judge's ruling was ironclad. Not only was their petition dismissed, but they were also held legally responsible for my entire court costs and legal fees, a sum that was, as David put it, substantial. For a couple already living on the edge, propped up by the illusion of a future inheritance, it was a final, devastating blow. David told me what happened next, piecing the story together from legal notices and courthouse chatter. Their beautiful, fragile world, built on a foundation of future wealth, collapsed overnight. The lawsuit had been their final gamble, and they had lost everything. Faced with crippling debt and the stark reality of a future without my money, their marriage disintegrated. It had never been a partnership of love, but a business arrangement, and the business had just gone bankrupt. Brianna, unable to face a life of mediocrity, a life without the luxury she felt she was owed, was the first to break. There were bitter, ugly fights, a storm of accusations and blame. She called Malik weak, a failure, a fool who had let his senile father outsmart them. He in turn finally saw her not as an ambitious partner, but as the architect of their ruin. Within a month, she was gone. She packed her designer clothes and left, disappearing from our lives as quickly and destructively as a summer storm, leaving Malik alone in the wreckage. Weeks passed. I began the slow work of breathing life back into my home and myself. I started the legal process of activating Evelyn's workshop for young builders, meeting with community leaders and trade school instructors. The house began to feel like my own again. I spent my days in the workshop, the familiar scent of cedar and oak a balm to my soul. The work was slow, methodical. It was healing. Then one afternoon I looked up from my workbench and saw a figure walking up the long gravel driveway. It was Malik. He was not driving his fancy SUV. I assumed it had been repossessed. He was on foot, and he looked thin, tired, and utterly defeated. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by failure and humility. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out and was only now beginning to wonder what might fill the empty space. He did not come to the house. He walked directly to the workshop and stopped just outside the open doors, hesitating on the threshold as if he had no right to enter. I put down my chisel and stepped out to meet him, wiping my hands on my canvas apron. We stood there for a long moment in the quiet of the afternoon, the silence stretching between us filled with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that had been broken. He did not look at my face. He looked at my hands, at the sawdust clinging to my clothes, at the sturdy workbench visible behind me. He looked at a life of tangible, honest work that was so alien to his own. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes for the first time were not filled with entitlement or shame, but with a desperate, fragile hope. He swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. Can I learn?" He did not ask for money. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked for a purpose. He asked for a chance to build something instead of just taking. In that one question, I saw the flicker of the sun I thought I had lost forever. I saw the man Evelyn had gambled on, the man she hoped still existed beneath the layers of weakness and entitlement. I did not give him a long speech. I did not say "I told you so." The moment was too sacred for the smallness of words. I simply looked at my son, held his gaze for a long moment, and then turned and walked back into the workshop. I picked up a clean, sturdy canvas apron, one that had been hanging on a peg unused for years. I walked back out and held it out to him. His hands, once so soft, trembled as he took it from me. He didn't speak. He just nodded, a single solemn gesture of understanding. And together we walked into the workshop. The seasons turned. Winter gave way to a gentle North Carolina spring. The workshop, once my solitary sanctuary, was now a place of shared purpose. Every morning, Malik would arrive not with the weary obligation of an employee, but with the quiet focus of a student. We worked side by side, the silence between us no longer awkward but comfortable, filled with the rhythmic sounds of our shared labor, the rasp of a hand plane, the bite of a chisel, the low hum of the lathe. I taught him everything I knew. I taught him how to read the grain of the wood, how to feel the story in each piece. I taught him that patience was a woodworker's greatest tool. He was a slow learner at first, his movements clumsy, his mind still accustomed to the instant gratification of a world he no longer belonged to. But he was persistent. He stayed late, practicing cuts, studying designs, his hands gradually transforming. The soft, pale skin grew calloused and strong. He was not just building things out of wood. He was rebuilding himself. One afternoon, months after he had started, we were finishing a set of small, sturdy desks, the very first project for Evelyn's workshop for young builders. They were to be donated to the local community center for their after-school program. Malik was sanding the top of a desk, his movements confident and rhythmic, his attention completely absorbed in the task. He looked up at me, a light in his eyes I had not seen since he was a small boy who believed his father could build anything. "She would have liked this," he said quietly. I placed my hand on his shoulder. "She would have been very proud of the man who built it," I replied. In that moment, I knew Evelyn's plan had not been about victory or justice. It had been about this. It was a crucible designed to burn away the weakness, to test the character of our son, and to leave behind something strong, something real, something worthy of her memory. He had lost a fortune, but he had finally inherited something of true value. True inheritance is not what is left to you, but what is left inside you. Character, resilience, and dignity are assets that no one can take away, and they are the only foundation upon which a life of true worth can be built.